This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program, Living Legends Collection. This interview was originally conducted on March the 12th, 1965. The interview is conducted by Mr. Frank Doyle. The interviewee is Mr. Robert F. Long of the Levy Long and Company of Oklahoma City. This interview is being re-recorded on April the 4th, 1985, for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
Today, this is the 12th day, isn't it? 12th day
That's
of
right.
March 1965, and we're on the topmost floor of the Colcord building. 1300,
1300.
and it's
Right.
the offices of
V.V. Long and Company.
V.V. Long. What is V.V. Long and Company, just to clarify for the record?
V.V. Long and Company is a consulting engineering firm that was founded by my father in 1919.
Yes,
And the only work we do is engineering work for municipalities.
Your correct initials are?
RF.
RF.
Robert F.
Robert F. Well, we're on a historic site, you might say, because everyone, they should know about the Colcord building, that it was, as we understand it, the first high-rise building in downtown Oklahoma City, right?
Well, that's correct. And
When was it built?
Well, it was built, and the first occupants, I understand, moved in 1910.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my father moved in these offices in 1919, and we've been in those offices continuously since that date.
Mm-hmm. I can see some of the history all around us here,
Yeah.
some of these old binders that probably contain a great deal of information. It would be more or less jumbled as far as we're concerned, but obviously is of some use to a consulting engineering firm.
Well, it is. My father kept pretty complete files of all the work we did, and even as of this date, it's not unusual for me to have a call from a town or a city somewhere in the state of Oklahoma regarding some project that the company handled in 1910, after 1919.
When did your father come here? Let's see if we can trace chronologically the history of the Longs.
My father came to Oklahoma City in 1916, when I was 2 years old.
From where?
He came here from Kansas. He was operating a water treatment plant in, I believe it was Marysville, Kansas. He had gone to work for a consulting engineering firm in Kansas when he got out of, graduated from the University of Kansas, and had worked for them several years, and this plant that he was on in Marysville was one he had been the engineer on while it was under construction. He worked for another engineering firm here in Oklahoma City, and after the war he started his own firm. That was in 1919.
What essentially does now this gets into probably too long a description, but I think you could boil it down. People are aware of engineering concerns and what they do in specifics. What is a consulting engineering firm's function?
Well, let's see. Of course,
I imagine
a consulting engineering firm usually they specialize in different practices. It happens that our firm specializes only in municipal construction, which would have to do with any type of work that a municipality would undertake to do, such as water, sewers, light plants, gas systems. We've even designed several swimming pools and actually a couple of skating rinks that are municipally owned for
In other words, you stick to municipal projects.
That is right. Of course, I can read you the definition of a consulting
I can
engineer.
see that there.
What
What is a consulting engineer? Well, I'm going to put some of that in the record anyway, for the simple reason that. But let's get back to your father and find out why did he come here to Oklahoma City, since this is a part of the Living Legend Library at Oklahoma Christian College, and has to do with mainly Oklahoma City and the people who helped build it, and everyone, it seems, and to their credit, no matter what they've done, have contributed to the growth of the city.
Well, actually, from talking to my father, the reason he came to Oklahoma was that Oklahoma at that time was a comparatively new state in the Union, and he saw at least to him, there was going to be more opportunities for an engineer getting started in his own business or his own field that he wanted to be in. And I can remember, of course, my childhood traveling with him to different towns and cities throughout the state. And I, of course, vividly remember that there were practically no paved roads at all in the States, few and far between. And none of the municipalities at that time really had much in the way of water systems. Sewage treatment plants was in its infancy, and no one, there was very little treatment of sewage then.
They didn't know too much about it, did they?
Well, there was, of course, there was quite a bit of knowledge available, but Oklahoma was just then starting as a state. None of the, very few of the cities or towns had any paving at all to speak of. It was one of my, I guess my most vivid memories of my childhood was going with my father to Seminole, which was an oil boom town and just mushroomed overnight. Of course, he would, when he'd go down there to their council meetings, he usually turned me over to the police chief to look after me while they had their meetings. I can remember they had no city hall and just a very small jail, and the prisoners and the drunks would be just chained around trees and
really rustic
in the yard, and it was very primitive. You wouldn't think that at all these days if you'd go to Seminole.
How rapidly time changes everything.
Yes. Of course, we put in, Father did some of the first light plants in the state of Oklahoma. Of course, in those days you had just a very small plant, and you had to more or less sell the people that electricity was here to stay. And your loading of a plant was so small because even your business houses down the street maybe would only have 2 or 3 just plain 40-watt lamp drops from the ceiling. That's the only way they were lighted.
What were some of the first ones you remember that he put in?
Oh, I'd have to look them up. See. You want to switch that off? I'll go get one of mine. So you were asking about the first light plants?
Yeah, I was wondering about some of the early projects.
Well, some of the early ones, of course, practically all of them now are, most of the smaller towns, the systems have been taken over by your large public utility companies. Mm-hmm. But one of the first ones that we put in, and which is still active and which we're now doing some engineering work on enlarging, is Marlow, Oklahoma, and that work was done in the early 1920s. Some of the others that were, of the earlier ones, were at Weatherford and Waleetka, and Wetumpka, Wynnewood, and Canton. Those were some of the earlier plants.
Who did he have with him in business? Do you remember?
Well, my father started the business on his own, and he took in a partner by the name of Connor, Earl Connor.
Mm-hmm.
And then shortly after that, the two of them took in as a partner Mr. Lee Bush.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether you know him or not. He was later city engineer, and
No, of him. Yeah.
then he practiced engineering on his own and is just recently retired. He might be a good man for you to talk to,
Yes, I imagine he
because
would.
his office is here in this building.
Mhm.
He went through practically all of the earlier days with Dad.
You recall some incidents that your father may have talked about, or some of the things that impressed him that were perhaps unusual? Oh, it's a little bit cold or a little bit difficult to pick them up cold right out of your head, with being so closely associated.
No, I can't offhand.
Did you go into come into the business, into the firm with him after you were in school?
Yes, I was one of those fortunate individuals that decided when I was a small boy, evidently when I was traveling around with my father, because in those days, of course, I've already told you there were practically no highways.
Yeah.
Since there were 6 of us children, Dad usually, I being the oldest boy, would take me with him on trips, so he'd have somebody with him to drive home at night. And of course, getting home at night then meant probably 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, depending on whether it rained or not.
Yeah.
But I decided, of course, then I was going to be an engineer, and even though Dad had graduated from KU, at his request, which was wise, he thought it'd be better if I went to OU, because the work that we were doing was here in the state of Oklahoma, and it would be better to meet people that you'd be doing work with in the future. I graduated in 1935 and went to work for him upon graduation. I was one of the better paid graduates then, because he paid me $60 a month and my room and board. So I had a good job.
And that was big money, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Well, you people, this firm has been engaged in so many activities around the city here. Say we narrow it down even to the city, haven't you?
Yes, we've handled quite a bit of work for Oklahoma City. Of course, the largest project that we handled for the city was the engineering work on the construction of Lake Hefner and the Lake Hefner filter plant, which was actually done during the war most of it was, while I was away in the service. Of course, while I was stationed in Fort Sill, I came up to Oklahoma City usually every weekend, and so I was familiar with the project as long as I was stationed there.
That was quite an undertaking, wasn't it?
Well, yes, it was, and it was doubly or increasingly hard due to the fact that the war came on. Because I went into service in 1940, because being a reserve officer at that time, it was announced, of course, that all of us would have to have a year's active duty in order to qualify to retain our commissions. And I naturally, I wanted to get my year over with, because this Lake Hefner job was coming up. And of course, the war started before I got out, and so instead of being there a year, I was there 6 years.
6 years. Boy. quite a tour of duty, didn't it?
Yes, but again, I was fortunate there because when my commission was in the field artillery, due to being an engineer, they put me over on duty with the constructing quartermaster, who at that time handled all the construction for the Army. And they had the job then of building a camp for the 45th Division to go to, if you remember. And later on, of course, when the Corps of Engineers took over all the construction work, then they transferred me to the Corps of Engineers. So actually I was on engineering or construction work all the time that I was in the Army, except for the last few months for it.
Some people would say that's most unusual.
Yes, it is.
For the Army, it puts you in the fields in which you're conversant and proficient. Well, this office we're in now, 1300, this is the top of the Colcord building. You say your father moved in 1919.
Well, he was actually here. This is the only office he ever was in, because the other engineering firm that he came here to be with had their offices here, and they were closing it and moving to Kansas City after the First World War. He had 4 of us children, but then he didn't want to move, so he borrowed enough money to pay the first month's rent and started in business himself.
Any of your other brothers in the business?
No,
You're the only engineer.
I'm the only engineer.
That's somewhat unusual, isn't it?
Well, just depends on what a man likes, I guess.
I guess. Usually with that many boys, there's at least 2.
No, there were only 2 of us
Or
boys
2.
and then 4 girls.
4 girls. When did your father pass away?
Well, he passed away in February the 11th of 1962.
From all reports, he was a pretty active man.
He was up until really just 2 days before he died. He'd had a heart attack about a year before that, but he'd completely recovered from it. He was active and down to the office up till 2 days before he passed away.
Well, isn't that something?
Now, you spoke of this being the first high-rise building. I think I told you that when I was a boy and working as an office boy up here, I was in a very enviable position with the other classmates because we had the highest office in Oklahoma City. Of course, that changed shortly after that when they started construction of the other buildings.
I noticed downstairs in the lobby of this building, I've seen it before, but actually I've never taken time to look around. What a magnificently done building, if you can put it that way.
Yes, Mr. Colcord was, I knew him, of course, slightly, but he was an amazing individual. I think that when he built this building, he wanted it to stand forever, and I think it probably will, because it's my understanding that he just had him double up on the steel and everything else. And it's still, I think, it's the best kept building in the downtown area.
Oh, it's just as solid, and you look at it and see some of the material that's been put into this thing.
No, nothing's changed. It still has the large lobby it had originally, with high ceilings. Of course, it's all air conditioned now, so it has all the advantages any other building.
The Lake Texoma project, of course, that's completed now for all intents and purposes, isn't it? Or is there anything else to do?
The Lake Texoma?
Or the, not Texoma, but the...
the Lake Hefner?
Yeah.
Yes, that was
And the water.
completed.
And the water.
Yes, actually, the filter plant's been added on to since it was originally constructed. We didn't handle that.
Are you
additional
working on
work.
anything particular now?
No, actually, I haven't been too active since my father passed away, because I had the selling of his estate to do. And it was one of his properties was he had a large ranch holding down here by Okema, which I just sold recently. Of course, my father, he had some of the first thoroughbred horses here in Oklahoma. He raised and trained himself and took to some of the smaller tracks around the country, like Hot Springs, Omaha,
They were not quarter
Denver.
horses.
No,
but
they're thoroughbreds.
Yeah.
A thoroughbred's a breed of horse. A quarter horse, that's another
right.
breed of
That's
horse.
another breed.
Yeah, I know that was one thing that always upset Dad, was to hear somebody pointed a dog and said, that dog's a thoroughbred. That saddle horse, you know, that you have in these horse shows, say that horse is a real thoroughbred. Of course, the only thoroughbreds you see in these regular horse shows would probably be a jumper. The others are all saddlebred, American saddlebred, which is a breed of horse.
That's
Just
right.
like Arabian or talk about a thoroughbred cow or a thoroughbred.
Well, the word, I think,
Catherine.
has been taken out of context and used
Yes.
More or less as an adjective instead of a noun.
But he was in the old school. They thought that, of course, having been raised on a farm, Dad always had a ranch or a farm someplace to occupy.
Well, that was their heritage, most of these pioneers around
That's
here.
right. His only, we never could get him to take a vacation until he bought these thoroughbreds, because, of course, after that he would go down to Hot Springs with Mother for a month, because he considered that business, you see.
Sure. Yeah, well, it really wasn't vacation. He
No.
probably didn't like the name, didn't
No,
like that
he
word,
didn't.
vacation.
But he was always very good to anybody that worked for him. He wanted them to have their vacations and take them. But he always said those were for people that could afford them and not people that had 6 children to raise. But he educated all 6 of us, put us all through college. None of us had to.
Well, how old was he
They
when he
weren't.
passed on?
See, Dad was 72. 72.
Oh, that's still pretty young.
But his, the only hobby he had, of course, outside of his ranch or farm or horses, was golf. He played golf regularly. He played twice a week up until he had his heart attack. He never played after that.
Well, this is one of the old-time businesses here, then, isn't it?
Yes, it's
Was there any
the.
other firm of
We, of course, like to
temporary agent around?
pride ourselves that we're the oldest firm here in the state in the point of continuous years in business, because we're able to stay in business all during the Depression. I think you may find the firms that were started prior to ours but
Didn't last.
that either went out of business during the Depression and then came back into business later.
Is it a pretty tough business?
Yes, and it's, in a way, it's getting tougher all the time for people like I am that are in the, strictly in the municipal field, because we find that the federal government with their programs are becoming more and more involved in doing work that a municipal consultant formerly handled. to give you an example, the city of Clinton out here had retained us to make them a report on a additional water supply which they needed, and which we had filed, and they had gone so far as to make the initial proceedings on calling for a bond election to finance it. Well, the Bureau of Reclamation then came in with the construction of their false reservoir up there on the Washita, and then Clinton was going to participate in the water from that dam on a of course they have it set up on a repay basis where Clinton eventually pays the government back, but the fact that they of course went in with the federal government just stopped them constructing a water supply all on their own. And of course you find a lot of these reservoirs, for instance, particularly over the state now, that they're justified because they have municipal buyers of the water. What that means, of course, it's not saying that there's anything wrong with it, but it just means that engineering business that formerly we would have on developing water supplies, the government is doing part of their program. Of course, on the other side of the fence, you'd have to say that some of these government programs they've come out with on making grants and loans to municipalities for improving their sewer systems, it's given the engineers more work. But frankly, we've only done one of those jobs, and it's only because it's a city we've done all their work for years, and we did it really as we felt as a favor to them because the paperwork involved is not worth it to us. I'm sure if you had a large firm or set up where you could handle all that kind of work as a matter of course, it wouldn't bother you. But and of course, some of your cities still retain their own light plants. Your public service companies have gotten so large that most of them have stopped operating their own plants and just buy their current wholesale from the larger companies.
I noticed that particularly when we came out here to Oklahoma a few years ago. I was raised in Ohio, and when I was a kid, although there were some large commercial suppliers, most of the smaller areas had their own plants, their own municipal plants.
You can see more of those, well, even in Kansas. Some of those states back there who have, for many, many years, had what they call the revenue bonds. Of course, they're where you can pledge revenue to pay back a debt. It's been much more feasible to go ahead and construct those plants. It's only been in the years since this trust works has been authorized by our legislature that Oklahoma was in a similar situation.
Now they buy it and pass it on.
Well, yes, but you see, if Oklahoma had had that law here 20 years ago or 30 years ago, all of these cities would have found it profitable to have built their own plants and gone into business and kept them up like they have in some of the states like where you're talking about. But we've found in our experience that, of course, these cities that do have their own light plants are the cities that have the money to operate on, and they're not are not hard up for revenue. You asked me if a while ago if I remembered anything that my father used to talk to me about, and I do know one thing that he always tried to impress on me, the way he felt, that any work that he did for any city, he always liked to look at it that the fees that they paid him, the city's more than got back in the type of work that they received. Because he's a firm believer that you had to give a full dollar's value for every dollar you received. And I think, to me, it's proven out, because he was able to stay in business during the Depression when a lot of the others either had to go to work for someone else or had to move their all. And I think, to me, it's proven out, because he was able to stay in business during the Depression when a lot of the others either had to go to work for someone else or had to move their offices out to their homes or operate out of the car, so to speak.
Yeah, it's not easy to be in business on.
No.
This picture here, this Seminole area, the oil fields, the world's greatest oil field.
Yes, that's a picture he's had made at that time, because it was one of the, I would guess, the first town that we worked in that really, you might say, was a lucrative proposition, because the oil boom hit about the time we were doing our first little water job for them, and naturally they were so satisfied with him that they retained him for all their work, and we did many, many miles of paving, and as well as water and sewer and other work in Seminole. Well, that's a picture there of the spillway at the Boomer Creek Dam in Stillwater. That was a design that he worked out, was one of the first ones here in the state of Oklahoma, a circular design. As you see, capacity of a spillway depends on the area around it, or the length of the spillway and the height of it for the water to go over when you're having a flood. So I doubt whether it was his own idea, but it was idea he had of building in a circular shape. He could get that spillway in a much smaller area and still obtain the same result. Now, that lake was one, of course, that later on the soil conservation practices that they entered into up there out of the college practically dried that lake up, because it kept all the water on the drainage area. I think the only time that lake's ever full now would be if you had a large gully washer.
Not like this good soaking rain we've had the last few days.
No, this, you can't have a rain to suit everybody. People with water supplies, they'd like to have a hard rain so they get the runoff, and the farmers and everybody else, they'd like a slow soaking rain so they wouldn't get drowned.
It looks like this was a farmer's rain.
That's right.
Any more engineers in the Long family?
No, unless my son turns out to be one. Of course, he's just 12 now, but a little early for him to decide what he wants to do.
In this confused world, they not make up their minds so easily.
No, the world's changed so considerably that who knows, there may not be much need for this type of an engineer by the time he's trying to make a living.
Yeah.
No, at one time, Dad had a branch office in Nashville, Tennessee, and we worked Tennessee and Kentucky and those states out of that office. But of course, that was closed during World War II. You couldn't get men, and we had the Lake Hefner job started then, so let's close that office and move those men back here in order to do this job.
He must have been a pretty good salesman too.
No, actually, Dad didn't like sales work at all.
Well, I mean, personally, he must, whether he realized it or not, must have been a pretty good
Well,
salesman.
he was a
Convincing.
To
man.
me, he was the most convincing man because he believed what he believed, and to him, there's only one way of doing it, and that was the way that he thought was right. When he had his partners, he handled all the engineering work in the office, over all the design work, and the other members of the firm were the ones that you might say were out trying to promote business. And of course, that was the work that I went on after I got out of college, because I enjoyed that type of work. Of course, I knew he didn't. But he could go before council and make a pretty convincing speech if it needed to be made.
Yeah, well, he sure knew his subject, didn't he?
Yeah. That's what he always told me. He said, remember, you should know about 10 times what everybody knows that's listening to you, or else you shouldn't be in the business.
Yeah, pretty good philosophy.
How long do those tapes run?
Oh, this runs an hour.
An hour.
On one
Wow.
side. Runs at 3 3/4 instead of 7 1/2. Well, I know the college appreciates you taking your time and sort of jogging your memory about some of the activities when your father came here and started in business and so forth, because as we mentioned earlier, everyone who's had anything to do with the city or the state has, well, there's still a lot of their contemporaries around. It's more or less the first generation.
Well, that's right, because you can... what you're saying, he was the first generation, really, of municipal engineers here in the state.
Wow.
It's a lot different when you go back east and you see the people of the fifth and sixth generations and so forth, and
Right.
different companies. Well, I'm glad to do it. I still, as I told the president, thought that you should be talking to people who've been here much longer.
Well,
than I
they're
have.
including people like that also. And it's too bad they couldn't start this a few years ago to catch
Yes.
some of these men before they left. And although there's still some around
Yes, there's still...
that we have talked with, like, as we mentioned, Judge Hefner and old Mr. Cornett out here, who's Tyker's father-in-law.
Oh, I
Who
know.
was here prior to the statehood. He was here when it was territory. A real old cowboy.
Well, my father-in-law came here prior to it being...
What was his name?
his name is V.V. Harris.
Uh-huh.
And I can remember some of the stories that he used to tell, of course. You know, when he founded his first bank down at Conemaugh, Had a picture of him. He was the president, the cashier, and the janitor. The picture we had of him was sweeping the walk in front of it in the morning.
That's more or less in the Dan Hogan style. Mr. Hogan, he was one of those earlier ones too.
Yes, he knew. But he got his license to practice law by, Mr. Harris did, by studying and reading with a federal judge, which is the way you got to be a lawyer before they ever had a bar.
Yeah.
And of course later on, after he'd been successful now in the Holdenville, Wewoke area, he moved to Oklahoma City and was one of the original directors when the Liberty National Bank was started.
Oh.
And he took all three of the children, moved to Norman, built a house, and went through the school at Norman so he'd have a regular degree.
That's amazing.
Then he moved back to Oklahoma City.
How long was he in school? Do you recall him saying?
Well, I'm not sure. It seemed to me he was there 2 or 3 years. Completed the 4-year course, or 6-year course.
What did he do then? Come back here and practice law?
No, he never practiced law. He was in the investment business.
Was he
Dealt a lot in real estate.
what relation does he have here now?
Well,
Harris.
of course, he has one son that still lives in Oklahoma City, Bill, and then his oldest son, V.V. Jr., now lives in Tucson. Of course, Margaret and I married. We're here. There were just the 3 children.
Well, did he stay then? He didn't stay with the bank. He came back and went with
No, he's just a private investment business. Of course, he was the director of the bank up until he passed away.
Those 2 banks started almost the same time, didn't they? The First National was
No,
here
I
a
think
long
the
time.
First National started quite a bit before
I know they're in their
Liberty.
75th year.
Yeah.
Well, I mean the buildings. I was talking about the buildings.
Oh, the buildings, they were constructed about the same time, because I can remember the papers every day carrying the stories, about the race to see who could
Who'd be up
who'd
first?
be up first.
Oh, about what year was that? In the 20s, was it?
No, it was in, I believe it was in the early 30s, wasn't it?
I'm not sure.
I believe.
Tie it down.
Of course, the Liberty Bank was originally the Ramsey Tower. It was being built by Ramsey Oil Company. And then it was the APCO Tower. Didn't APCO buy it from Ramsey? And then the Liberty, Liberty then took it over from APCO. I believe now. That'd be a good one to trace, though.
We'll have that traced back and get that on tape too.
It's really the building I can remember building when they built the original Biltmore Tower over here across the street. And of course, you could see that right from our
Right from this office.
offices. Of course, remember the Depression caught it. Everybody was wondering whether it was going to be
What was it,
finished or not.
when did they start that? Before the crash?
It was started before the crash.
And was that locally?
No, I think the Biltmore started, and then it seemed to me like they, of course, went broke, and I believe that's a man you probably ought to talk to, is John Reinhardt, or not John, but Mr. Reinhardt. He's still very active. It was Reinhardt and Donovan then. They were the contractors on that. And I believe that they had to take a lot of stock in that for their payment of building it.
It's quite a thing. It's 28 stories, isn't it? Something like that.
Yeah, it's 30-some, I believe,
Okay.
isn't it? I'm not sure. You might check his name, see if you have him on your list.
He may be on the list, because we have...
Because they were one of the early pioneer contractors here in the state. I'm sure he'd have a lot of good personal memories he could remember.
I suspect so. And then the old Huckins went up too then, didn't
Yes, I'm not sure when that Huckins was.
We're going into the history of that
Yeah.
also.
It seemed to me that the Huckins was there before, wasn't it?
It's an older building.
Yes, I believe it was there before.
Sheridan now.
Because it was down close to the railroad tracks, which is where your hotels all used to be.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Mr. Long.
Well, I appreciate it. I don't have it helped very much.
Well, I'm sure you have.